My name is Cliff Robinson, and I'm the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. This evening's program falls within this year's series of public humanities events exploring the topic of democracy through this national election year. The series and tonight's program within it were made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are also grateful to the Princeton University Press and to Labyrinth Books for contributing to the organization and promotion of this program. It's my honor to introduce our two guests tonight, Professors Ismar Volic and Sam Wang. Ismar Volic is Professor of Mathematics and Director of the Institute for Mathematics and Democracy at Wellesley College. His work has appeared in publications such as The Hill, Cognoscenti, and Education Week. We are gathered here tonight to discuss his book. You can see some on display over here. His new book, Making Democracy Count: How Mathematics Improves Voting, Electoral Maps, and Representation. The title was published by Princeton University Press in April, and you can purchase a copy tonight through Labyrinth Books. Professor Volic has agreed to linger after the talk and sign copies. Do I have that right? Yeah? Signings? Okay, signing is good. We're on. All right. Professor Volic will speak briefly about his book in a moment here, and then he will be joined in conversation by Sam Wang, Professor of Molecular Biology and Neuroscience at Princeton University. Professor Wang's laboratory research focuses on learning from birth to adulthood at levels ranging from single synapses to the whole brain, but he is also deeply involved in the application of data analytics to American elections. The Princeton Election Consortium, which Professor Wang founded in 2004, provides informed analysis of U.S. national elections by members of the Princeton community using insights and predictions gathered from a large collection of polling organizations and computed through MATLAB scripts. With so much experience working at the intersection of mathematical modeling and electoral politics, Professor Wang is truly a worthy interlocutor for Professor Volic. Indeed, I can think of no one more suitable. So please welcome Professors Volic and Wang.
Thank you all for coming. This is, for a mathematician, this is unusual. We typically work in these tiny little corners of mathematics where, we write papers and books for a few people. And on average, this is an actual statistic, 1.5 people read a pure math paper. That includes the referee and you who wrote the paper. So having a little bit of attention like this is quite unusual. But I just wanted to say a word about why math and democracy, and I'll just speak for a couple of minutes, and then I'm eager to have someone to chat with here. There's sort of a simple observation that one makes. Now, that's sort of not fair, because all things are simple in hindsight, right, when you understand them. But this one is really simple. It says that most of our democratic processes are mathematical at their core. They're algorithmic, which really is code for mathematical. So when you think about things like voting processes, how we collect votes, how we tally votes, how we assign legislative seats, how we draw district lines, how we think about the Electoral College in terms of those assignments of legislative seats, how we quantify power, how we quantify representation. Those are all mathematical questions. They're all really mathematical at their core. And the tragedy is that we're not really used to thinking about them as mathematical questions and mathematical issues. The reason it's tragic is because math can say a lot about which of these processes are good and bad in an objective, universal, detached way. So, the stereotype of a mathematician is, a detached person hiding in their office doing the math. And I think that's actually good in this case. We need a detached approach to mending our democracy. And math can do this. It can offer this. It can look at these processes, this infrastructure of democracy, and say, look, this math is bad because of the following reasons: objectively, formally, universally, calculationally even. And it can say, well, there are these other processes which again, objectively, universally, work better in representing people, in producing outcomes that serve us better on the whole. So that was the motivation for this book, and the motivation for really everything I do in this space of of math and politics or math and democracy, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. We'll see come November 5th how fun it'll be, but I'm really enjoying it, and I'm sort of finding a parallel a career path in this that's really been exciting and rewarding. So that's all I have to say by way of introduction. Sam, help.
Well, I think that I think it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to Princeton.
Thank you.
I was just talking to Ismar about how, by coincidence, our kids are actually both seniors in high school. His son is visiting Princeton today. Our child is visiting Wellesley, which is Ismar's home institution tomorrow. So we've got a little exchange program going. And so I apologize for the weather. It's the worst day it's been in several months. But it is no reflection on the school. There are a lot of good days at Princeton. I just wanted to put that in. So let's jump in. I think that probably some people here have probably had a chance to read the book, but many have not. So why don't we just help people with some basics? Tell me, why'd you write the book?
So it started out. So let me back up. Let me go way back because the answer I think it's instructive or sort of illuminating to go way back. So I'm from Bosnia, which for those of you who are old enough remember that there was this horrible war of the early 90s in Bosnia. I was 17 at the time and ended up in the United States because of this war in Bosnia. But I was a budding mathematician even then. I was a junior, senior in high school. I went to a mathy high school, and I was busy, like growing out my hair and playing in the band and chasing girls and stuff. I'm not sure I even noticed the election until the war broke out, and I'm like, wait, there was this election that happened, and what was this election about? And then it turns out there were these methods in this election that I didn't understand mathematically. Like there were seven-member presidency, and then there was a second vote happening in the parliament for some reason, and there was a referendum on the independence of Bosnia. In any case, there were mechanisms there that were mysterious to me mathematically, procedurally. So that confusion and the question, would the outcomes have been different had a different method been used, right? I don't know the answer to that to this day, but there was this, kernel of the nagging question. What about these methods? Who decided these were going to be the electoral methods that ultimately ended in a complete demise of democracy, like as bad as it gets, complete with all the atrocities and everything, right? The term ethnic cleansing was invented in Bosnia, so they wouldn't say genocide, right? So I became a mathematician. And my research is in something called algebraic topology. It is a field of mathematics that deals with shapes and their properties. But all along, I felt like I needed to use my expertise for this kind of thing as well, some kind of a social good. Maybe it's kind of a worn-out phrase, but I needed to apply it in some way that the society might benefit from somehow. So eventually I started teaching a course at Wellesley, Math and Politics, which I have been teaching since. I teach it every year. I love it. I get to meet students who would not otherwise go anywhere near the math department because it doesn't have very many prerequisites. And it's just a fantastic way to teach this stuff in a really interdisciplinary way, which Wellesley students really like. So out of that grew this, eventually I realized I had learned some things and I had a certain take on these things, and I had this personal story that was informing the way I thought about these things. So that's where the book came out. The book really came out of this class that I teach. Now the publisher said, you should play that down a little bit because people are scared of math classes, so they don't want to feel like they're taking a math class when they're reading the book. So that's not as apparent in the narrative, but it really came out of this class that I teach.
But at the same time, I think, when I read the book, the teaching aspect really pops out as a way to bring people gently into the subject. For example, you start with an example about pizza toppings, which, we could talk about as just a slow introduction into, okay, we're just going to count, right?
Right, exactly. So that's how I actually do this in class. I ask the students, if you only could, pick one of two toppings on a pizza, what would we choose? And, they vote, and then there's a winner. But because it's two options, there's necessarily a majority winner, right? Then I throw in a third option, and almost always, I guess I chose the toppings well enough. Pepperoni, veggie, and barbecue chicken. I throw in the barbecue chicken, that's the wrench. And typically, the winner is just a plurality winner, not a majority winner. Some of those people who won the pepperoni or veggie now won barbecue chicken, and now you have, a winner without who's not winning the majority. And that leads us into the discussion of voting methods and how plurality, which is what this is about, is a terrible method, yet we pick almost all of our 520,000 elected officials using this mathematical dumpster fire of a method.
I guess you could even teach about the spoiler effect, because if you pick that third topping to be really close to one of the other two, like as close as possible, then that's the one that ends up losing, because you put the third choice right next to that.
Right next to it, takes away a couple of votes.
Like if it's similar to pepperoni, or if it denies the efficacy
barbecue
of
chicken and carnitas,
or if it denies the efficacy of vaccines, or or whatever that topping might do.
Absolutely, exactly right. Well, you're right. So the next examples are then of vote splitting and spoiler, and the examples I actually give of vote splitting is the person who represents the town that Wellesley College is in is Jake Auchincloss. He's in Congress, who won with 21% of the vote. And these three progressive, amazing women had split the vote. They got 20, 19, and 18 or something crazy like that. Yet Jake Auchincloss is in Congress now. He's a fine guy, but he is not right. And when you poll the people who voted for one of these three women, they all invariably said, no, we would have wanted one of these three women over Jake Auchincloss to go to Congress. But of course, plurality doesn't see that second tier, second level information. Compounded in this, in this result is the fact that many of our systems are designed to keep people in office. And so Jake Auchincloss, probably after tenure, right? It's like the cushiest job you could have, being in Congress. Jake Auchincloss will probably be sitting there for the next 30 years.
Unless he does something terrible. Right?
Unless he does something terrible,
really terrible.
Like punch a student or something.
Yeah, don't do that.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
We'll advise.
Yeah, that's against the rules here.
Yes.
But the thing is, I'm interested in this plurality rule, because this is not quite math. People think of math as being a scary subject, but now we're talking about arithmetic or counting. So this is a plurality rule, and is it ever the case that there are American laws that say, okay, if you get below a certain percentage, then that's still not enough?
Not that I know of, right? If plurality rule is the law of the land, that's it. You can win with as low a percentage as long as it's the largest percentage of all the candidates. So you could have 100 candidates, right, and someone could win with barely over 1%. But
one thing that strikes me is that there are a lot of hidden rules that people don't know about because they don't get into the arcana of it. So, for example, in the 2016 presidential primaries, Democratic Party's nomination processes for president were proportional, more or less. So if Hillary Clinton got 30% of the vote, she'd get 30% of the delegates, 40%, 50%. But on the Republican side, there was this threshold effect where if Donald Trump got 30%, he could get more than half or more of the delegates.
Right. There's a quota,
and so there's a reward
15%
there.
Or something.
Right. So, and now some would argue that that's a rule that's good because it forces consensus. So how do we feel about that?
Well, it depends. I think it depends on the context. I think the threshold of 50 or 20% that the Republicans have is too high, right? There's the quota has to be chosen very, very carefully.
30% was good enough for Donald Trump because he started at 30%, and then he built up from that.
Right. So you get the winner's bonus because of these things. So you sort of win more delegates than you sort of deserve. But if you're building, for example, a parliament, right? So let me give you Bosnia as an example. Bosnia has a 20% threshold for a party getting into parliament. That's way too high. It's designed to protect these three major parties in Bosnia, right? Israel had 1% until recently, that was a mess in the other direction. Everybody got in the parliament, and it was too dysfunctional, too many parties. There was you couldn't build consensus. So
But
they raised it.
people in the U.S. often want proportional representation. Wouldn't it be nice if 5% of the vote could elect 5% of the chamber? And so yet, here's an example of a parliament that's not terribly functional.
Exactly, right. So Turkey is at 10%, lowering it to 7 maybe to bring. So I think, well, when you talk to people about proportional representation, in principle, they agree with it. It sounds nice, right? Your seat share, the share of how much you participate in government is proportional to the percentage of votes you received, right? But in practice, that plays out nowhere in American politics, right? So you need to really change some things fundamentally, like get rid of the plurality vote and single-member districts and all these things to really arrive at proportional representation.
But people like to have their Congress critters. I mean, it's nice to have like one person who represents me in Congress, and I can go to her and I can complain about something. I mean, people like that kind of thing. So at some level, there are perceived advantages to having single-member districts. So that seems, and that's an old principle that goes back to Parliament.
Certainly, but it's no longer. It has been perverted to the point where it really doesn't make any sense. So if you go back to the founding of the country, and one of the biggest problems was deciding what this ratio should be. How many people should be represented by a representative? We're talking about the U.S. House now, and Madison was a vocal proponent of a number that was 30,000, right? Allowing for this number to grow to maybe about 50,000. He's like, if we get to 50,000 per representative, fine, it's not great, but fine. So he felt that this was a good number of people where the representative can still feel the pulse of the people, of the constituency, could know its concerns and problems and political preferences, et cetera. So 30 to 50,000. We are at 760,000 now.
Per district, per congressional district.
Per congressional district, meaning per representative, right?
But wouldn't it be fine to have a House of Representatives with 10,000 members?
Well, no.
No, you think that'd be a problem?
That might be a problem, yeah. But getting back to this question, is that people feel nice that there's somebody they can point to represents them. That's long gone. The gap is so huge between the people who represent us and us. There's a huge empty space that, of course, is very skillfully filled by lobbyists and special interest groups, et cetera. But we're long past that, I know who my representative is in Congress, so something has to change. So yeah, increasing the House would be one way to do this. And again, these multi-member districts may be a way to do it.
I mean, I've lived in Princeton for several decades now, and if I meet my member of Congress, that's a pretty significant event. It doesn't happen very often. On the other hand, our state senator, or the state assembly, a member of either chamber of the state legislature, it happens. I run into them.
Yeah.
And so I guess it must be that back in old times, it was not unheard of to actually meet your member of Congress face to face.
I don't think so. Again, it was the ratio was smaller, and this geographic proximity made sense, right? So the reason we have single member districts, so our districts, as you know well, are required to be in one piece, contiguous, right? And that was to preserve sort of communities that near each other geographically. Of course, the notion of a community has completely changed over time. I live in a suburb of Boston, and I have lots of neighbors who just go into Boston to work because it's impossible to rent or buy a house in Boston. It's way too expensive, so they rent out here in Natick, Massachusetts, where I live. And they probably go to, party in Boston on weekends. Is this the fact that we're geographically proximate? Does that mean we have the same interests and needs and political preferences? Not really. Or a lot of those people work from home, right? They just chose the place they live because of other considerations, not necessarily because the community is as such. So this notion of community, geographically close, it just doesn't make sense anymore.
Well, one thing that's changed, I think, is that back in the day, when Madison talked about, it was before political parties, when he talked about mischiefs of faction, I believe that it was Madison, among others, who thought that you couldn't really have national bitter partisanship because it just took too long to get from one place to another in the United States. And so if it took 6 weeks on muddy roads for people in Georgia to find people in, Massachusetts, you couldn't have bitter factions developing at a national level.
It took all of 2 election cycles to prove him wrong.
So I wonder, I mean, now with fast communication, it's, I do wonder about what defines a community. I mean, I like if I go into, I don't know, some farm community or some community 20 miles south of here, I could certainly find things in common with them. But if I go to a university on the other side of the country, or I'm about to go to my conference, which is 30,000 people in my field, that's about the size of one colonial congressional district.
Madison district.
Right, one Madisonian congressional district, and we're all going to be in Chicago.
And that's your community, sure.
And that is my community. And so I wonder whether, some rethinking of what it means to have a community at a national level.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree, and you can even, there are examples that are even more concrete. Massachusetts has 30-something% of Republican voters, and because they're geographically spread a certain way, there's really no way for them to get any kind of representation.
That's right. I believe our colleague Moon Duchin and her team at formerly at Tufts, now at Cornell, they did a computational simulation.
They did a simulation. They proved that there is no districting.
There's no way to draw a Republican district in Massachusetts.
No possible districting that will give Republicans a vote.
Like they tried millions of times.
They tried millions of times.
And they couldn't do it.
And if you do it precincts are your unit of measure, you cannot combine enough precincts.
So that's 37% of people in Massachusetts who are never going to be represented in Congress in the next decade or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Our delegation is 9 Democrats.
Yeah. But the thing is that this doesn't necessarily, but at the same time, at the local level, we have smaller constituencies. I can imagine, communities being represented, like there are representatives that this local district has had in Trenton, our state capital, who, in some ways represent this community more directly than they do in Washington. And so I wonder whether the federalist system in the United States can be helpful in resolving this old Madisonian problem that you're describing.
You mean helpful as in a model for how to build out the big federal system, or
smaller districts? Imagine having a national legislature where you have some kind of representation of large-scale communities, whether it be parties or other communities, whatever. I mean, not to skip the math, but which is. We shouldn't be doing that today, but rules that represent those communities at a national level, and then other systems for assuring that we gain representation locally.
Locally, sure, right. So maybe like mixed member district type thing. Some at large choices and some district widespread. Yeah, there's lots. There's lots of models for this. This is also another tragedy. We, in our American exceptionalism, we don't look anywhere else.
I wanted to ask you about that. So the United States, in some ways, is pioneering with the Constitution and these district-based systems. But what is it that makes the United States so, to a mathematician, maybe backwards in the way it picks representatives? Tell us about that.
We're just too full of ourselves. I mean, we tend to not look around, and we are one of the only democracies that has, again, single-member districts. Not a single country in the world has anything like the Electoral College. In fact, many countries have been created just in the last 30, 40 years. None of them wanted anything to do with this Electoral College system, right? So if you just look around and say, really, are we really doing things that well that nobody wants to emulate us? Nobody wants to emulate us.
Well, okay, but there have been improvements over time. I would say that having both major genders be able to vote, having people who don't own land be able to vote, in principle, allowing all racial and ethnic groups an equal opportunity to vote. Like these are advances.
Absolutely, but I'm sticking to math.
Sure. Okay. No. That granted.
Mathematically, just sort of algorithmically, procedurally, again, sort of infrastructurally, what's under the hood wise, we are an outlier.
But it's, I mean,
among
that way, I mean, I
democracies.
would say that in the context of everything else I just brought up, non-landowners, women, persons of color, all these different communities being able to vote. In some sense, the last, like especially, I would say, given what transpired with the civil rights era, I would present to you the argument that we're finally in a position where, in principle, math could really lead to the next stage of improvement. And so, you know, all the math in the world would not have helped in, let's say, 1940, when one district could be a major city in Tennessee and another district could be farmers of 1/100th the population. I mean, there's a massive representational problem. So at some level, the recent history of the last few decades creates an opportunity for math to have a seat at the table.
I would love for you to be right. I mean, that I would like nothing more than that to be the case. And I do think that's happening. First of all, more and more mathematicians are getting involved. More scientists. We're stepping out of our offices cautiously and kind of speaking louder. And people are starting to accept that the mathematical way might be one of the avenues to mend things. I mean, again, as you well know, the courts are starting to listen to us when it comes to gerrymandering. Right, 15, 20 years ago, they, what's his name, laughed us out of the Supreme Court, Roberts, right, when he, made fun of the efficiency gap.
Gobbledygook,
sociological gobbledygook, because somebody brought some equations in, and he's just like, what did he say? He said, a person in the street wouldn't understand this, so therefore I reject it. Well, you're not a person in the street. You're a Supreme Court justice.
You know, if I need an appendectomy, I'm probably not going to stop a person on the street.
Exactly, right.
One might want a specialist.
Right, and you look around and you got AI, you got cryptocurrency, you got quantum computing coming down the pipeline of these judicial hierarchies. I mean, they better start, paying attention to math. But I feel like, and again, you're the expert on this more. I mean, I feel like that has gradually changed.
I think for gerrymandering, it's normalized.
Yeah,
I was really interested in following the arc of the story of your book, where you talk about starting in pizza ordering and then getting into ranked choice voting, and then you can kind of get into some of the more arcane stuff like redistricting. And it was really interesting to see these things each get the mathematical treatment. Right. So that was nice. So the United States is an old country, and even though the accessibility of voting to individuals has changed over time, these rules seem to be kind of ingrained. But you brought up other countries, and they either are willing to try different things or they're younger countries. So can you talk about, I mean, you probably have followed the advent of democracies in various former Yugoslavian countries. Right. Is that an opportunity to try new rules, to try new things?
Absolutely, and as problematic as that part of the world is, former Yugoslavia, the Balkans, they actually did some things right. They as they were being formed, they looked around and said, what sort of systems that Western Europe have. They consulted some mathematicians. When Estonia became a country, they brought in economists from UC Davis, originally who's Estonian, and he calculated what the size of the parliament should be based on the Estonian population at the time. So these are all opportunities to do the right thing. Many countries reassess these systems over time. So, New Zealand had brought in ranked choice voting at some point that they decided this was a better thing to do. Many countries changed the size of their chambers according to shifts in population. So you have to, there are places around the world that are used to revisiting things based on mathematical considerations. Not all of them, I mean. But
I'm having just a little trouble imagining that in the United States.
Yeah.
What would it take for some kind of technical expert to be trusted enough to help out with redesign? That seems like a kind of a hard lift.
Yeah. You mean for like the Congress or some committee of the Congress to invite a mathematician?
Like, for instance, here's an example. Like a current reform in front of Congress right now that's been proposed as a bill is bringing in districts, as you say, that's multi-member, more than, let's say, 3 to 5 members of Congress per district, and then you have a rule for selecting who represents that district.
Right.
So that, maybe a 5-member district would have, say, 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, or 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats, or what have you. And that's, mathematically appealing, but it doesn't seem like it's imminent.
No. I think it's important to have this Fair Representation Act, which is what I think you're referring to,
Yes.
in Congress and brought in front of Congress over and over again for PR purposes. I don't think, just to raise, for advocacy and to raise awareness, I don't think it'll get adopted in my lifetime, but it's important it's there. Where I see the changes, the way change happened in the U.S. several times over the last 250 years, and that is starting locally and sort of, growing too. So I have to, and what gives me hope is, people like my son who's sitting over there, he's running, he's 17, he can't vote yet, but he's running a ranked choice campaign in our town of Natick with a bunch of friends from high school. And they're doing the work. They're getting out there, talking to the select board, and they're talking to the town, town council, and this is what motivates me.
Maybe to defend our fair country a little bit, maybe it's hard to make change at the level of 350 million people, and that maybe it's helpful, and in some ways the fragmentation of the former Yugoslavia is helpful because now we're talking about a few million people. Like a country like, say, I don't know, North Macedonia has what?
A couple million
people. And that's a country that could conceivably come together and say, you know what, let's try something new.
That's right.
So that it feels like maybe that's an advantage. And then, of course, trust in institutions enough to let some nerd come in and say, gosh, it seems like you might need a abort a rule to get into the weeds a little bit.
But I think that's where the U.S., I don't want to knock down the federal system completely, right? There's something to be said for all this autonomy, sovereignty of states, and this, the labs of democracy role that they play. So that could be happening at the level of sort of North Macedonia size in states where they could test things out. They could try things like ranked choice voting or multi-member districts and show the rest of the country that it works.
These things are being tried. So like this November, I would be remiss to not mention a tool that my electoral innovation lab has developed, where we developed a thing called Vote Maximizer, and you go to votemaximizer.org, and you can see experiments in democracy that are on the ballot this November. Open primaries where everybody gets to vote in one big primary in Nevada, Idaho, Arizona, Colorado, right? All these states that may get that experiment. Experiments in taking the power of redistricting away from politicians in Ohio and putting it into a kind of a jury, as it were, of citizens. So I think that there's, I guess I would, I get accused often of being excessively optimistic.
No, and there are 90+ ranked choice initiatives in various municipalities around the country. No, I think I'm getting back to what you said, the optimism of like the time being ripe for some kind of quantitative analysis to be considered seriously.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to be optimistic now, but I would say that that the first Gilded Age was a period of racial division, technological change. People were disrupted out of jobs. And here we are in a second Gilded Age. But that first Gilded Age gave way to the first Progressive Era. And women gained the vote during that Progressive Era. Senators became elected by popular vote. So I think, I would say patience might be called for, but one can imagine change.
One can imagine change, especially, again, I find, comfort and solace in the people immediately around me, again, like my son or my students, who are just, I teach this class on math and politics, they are just outraged that no one had ever told them about all these things, right? How terrible electoral college is mathematically, right? Weighed against the one person, one vote principle, or like in terms of distribution of power for various voters across states, or this vote splitting and all the stuff that plurality brings around, gerrymandering and all this stuff. They're just outraged, and many of them leave my class saying, I'm going to go back to my town, my state, I'm going to do something.
Do they do stuff?
And they do stuff.
Oh, yeah?
They do stuff. I have a student who I'm working with who's doing something in her town in Maine to change things. Wow. Sorry, New Hampshire. Maine has ranked choice.
So you could like this Wellesley-based fountain of
exactly right
of people.
Right. And Wellesley students, they're really, when they start digging at something, they will dig their way through the earth. So it really is. It's possible.
That's great. That's an inspiration. Well, tell you what. This has been terrific, and I think what would be really great would be if people have an interest, maybe we can open it up a little bit to a general discussion. I might be overwhelmingly tempted to leap in with another question, but what I feel like might be nice, Cliff, if you think it's okay, let's go and maybe have a little general discussion and see what others in the room have to say or ask. And you know, I will say that many of these things we talked about, the math behind it is in here, and I really recommend this book. But maybe let's open it up.
That sounds good, Sam. Yeah, we can take questions now. So, and Sam, I think I remember you said you needed to leave at this point. Is that correct?
No, I'm okay for now. In fact, depending on how things go, I have questions for him about Macedonia for arcane reasons. But
I'm not trying to rush you out by no means.
Yeah, we want to get our Macedonia on. So.
Understood. Okay, so yeah, questions from the audience.
In front, we have a question.
So I was curious about your comment about being in Massachusetts, a deep blue state. So if you were one of the 30% who were Republican and wanted to make an impact as to who was ultimately going to be your representative or senator, would you recommend that they try to register as a Democrat and vote in the Democratic primary, or just stay in the?
You mean vote like
if it's an open primary?
If it, yeah,
I don't know
no, I wouldn't. I just don't see a. There are mathematical reasons why I don't think you want to do that, but it's just, like the strategy and dishonesty there's got to be a better way, right? Although we are forced in these plurality elections, right? So, for example, in the Democratic primary in 2020, I voted for a candidate who was not my first choice because I thought he could beat Trump, and he did. But he was not my first choice. So the system is encouraging me to think strategically and vote not my conscience, right? Yeah.
What about advocating for a rule to, I don't know, is Massachusetts a closed primary state?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can imagine like a reform in which anyone can vote. Like for instance, I believe in Michigan, if I recall correctly, anyone can vote in any primary. Here in New Jersey,
Alaska.
In New Jersey, it's harder. I'm registered independent, and I get the option of choosing a primary ballot, but I have to re-register then afterwards. And as Ismar has just said, Alaska and Maine have an all-party primary, which is an inspiration to these other places that Idaho, Nevada, Arizona that I was talking about. So I think but I think you're asking a more immediate thing, which is what one can do now.
No, right. Yeah, not right.
Yeah,
not
I think the other option would
much.
be to turn towards local governance as a means of getting representation. Because there are pockets, if you look in the central part of Massachusetts, kind of towards the south, I forget where,
that's right,
kind of
like
west of where you are.
Kind of a little bit west.
There's
like
some concentrations of
Palmer,
Republicans.
Right.
And so local representation is a way to get representation. And so one would, it's not ideal, but it is a way in which one could have one's voice heard.
But at the same time, you're just going to be mad at the fact that the entire 2 senators and 9 representatives in Washington are all Democrats, and there you are, a Republican, and 30-something% of people, the residents of Massachusetts, agree with you.
I do think that looking at different levels of government is something that's, I think we're habituated to looking at the bright, shiny object, which is, Harris versus Trump.
Right.
I mean, that bright, shiny object turns out to have significant consequences for democracy itself. But it is nonetheless the case that we focus on that.
That's right.
And if you look at state, county, local levels, people have power in many ways, and that might be a way for people in Massachusetts.
And all politics is local, as we know.
Yeah. I mean, I just said Vote Maximizer, like we calculated that at least 88% of people in the United States have some kind of decisive leverage at a lower level of government. And 88% is pretty good.
But that's actually,
It is. It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's a lot. 44 out of 50 states, there's something, whether it be Congress, Senate, state legislatures, reproductive rights, direct democracy. If you go down the list, it works out to be a surprisingly large fraction. It's not satisfactory in the sense that you want a thing for your vote. So in that respect, it's that greater satisfaction is a long-term program.
Right. That's true. We are focused on the immediate and the now. Obviously, this election and coming up, and many people should feel outraged about the Electoral College and the way in which their vote is completely disregarded, as are those Republicans in Massachusetts, right? You know, Harris is going to get those 11 electoral votes from Massachusetts, and there's nothing that the Republicans can do.
If I were a Republican in Massachusetts, I'd be door knocking in New Hampshire because there are several swing districts there. And what I would be doing is looking to swing power there, because even though I'm not that person's constituent, I would thereby gain representation in Washington through that. And it's not ideal. It's basically a workaround to the current system. Yeah, maybe back there.
Hi. We all want to get rid of the Electoral College. Could you talk a little bit more about the mathematical probability of a two-party system ever making a constitutional reform of that nature?
I have a lot to say about this.
Yeah, no, that's not math.
Yeah,
that's politics, right? I mean, the left-leaning side of the spectrum agrees that electoral college should go. In fact, 63% of Americans agree with them. But this is a perennial problem. Any elected official is loath to, change the system that elected them, and we see that over and over again. This guy that I was talking about, Jake Auchincloss from the district where I work, he was a big proponent of ranked choice voting, but conspicuously fell silent about it after he got elected, using plurality votes. So I don't really know how much how much of this change would come from the top. There are workarounds that states can influence in their legislature. There's a sort of an elegant kind of a mathy cool way to get around the Electoral College. That also means getting around the Constitution, which I don't advocate for generally bypassing the Constitution. But in this case, I'm on board with it. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I've been working on the Electoral College in one way or another for 20 years, and although I certainly agree with the rhetorical goal of doing away with it, I think if we want to be realistic about it, there are ways forward. We've had 6 out of 7 presidential elections in the last 20 years decided by margins of less than 5% of the popular vote. And it's under those circumstances that the Electoral College, in some sense, fails. But it's also under those circumstances that people perceive that they have the most to lose. So if we're getting into the game theory of it and the strategy of it, right now, to state the obvious, one political party thinks that they get the short end of the stick, the Democrats. The other political party, the Republicans, perceive an advantage, and they do this year have an advantage of about 2 points. Who would give that advantage? But it was actually surprisingly recently that there was a serious move to do away with the Electoral College, and it seemed to have a shot. It was Jesse Wegman, who works at the New York Times, wrote a book called Let the People Pick the President. And Birch Bayh, who was a senator from Indiana back in the 70s, worked on major electoral reform, and one of the things that he worked on was the possibility of doing away with the Electoral College. It failed more or less because of Southern Democrats, for reasons that we could get into, for like not wanting that change. But it wasn't that long ago. I would say that the big picture, I think, is in a few decades, if we, assuming that we survive and if we get away from this knife edge that we're on now, would be a better time to revisit that. Now, I'm going to say this is like the worst workaround possible. There is one way to eliminate most failures of the Electoral College to go with the majority vote, which is for California and Texas to get into a deal where they will both give all their electors to whoever wins the national popular vote. And this turns out, it's like BuzzFeed, this one weird trick. Well, this one weird trick actually does a good job, but this is a goofy trick. Who would ever do that? They hate each other too much, for one thing. Right. So, but I think there are some practical political problems here. Right.
So you can augment the Electoral College to be more representative. Like you can actually allocate electoral votes proportionally, which is not bad. It's not great. but it's certainly better
Yeah.
than,
You know,
than winner take all. But
that's been looked at, and if you do it retrospectively on the last 50 elections, it doesn't help that much.
doesn't help that much. It would help if the House was like, if you vary the House size, which is another thing which is tied to the Electoral College, right? The House size. But if you vary the House size and you tweak how you count this, like things.
That's right. If you could have
like
decimal
these knobs and things.
In the current system, if you could have decimal electors, if you could like take an elector. And cut them into 100 pieces, which
yes, I want to.
Sometimes, yes, yes. Let us not go there. But like if you divided them up like the Egyptian god Ra and like chop, chop, yeah, you could do that. But
there's also no reason why these have to be integer values, right? I mean, sure, there's some person that casts a ballot.
Yeah, we're recording this. I'm opposed to that. That's like electors should be handled peacefully.
Okay, you're in a record.
Yeah, this is an age when we actually have to stipulate that electors should be honored as responsible representatives.
As doing a service for the rest of us. But there's really no reason why they should be, the electoral votes should be attached to people. Right. Yeah, they are allocated according to party lines. You get an occasional faithless elector and so on. But really, they might as well be just numbers.
Yeah.
And in which case, proportional representation would get us there. You could also allocate votes district-wise, so each district should choose. This is what Maine and Nebraska do. That's not great. Proportional would be better.
What if they're gerrymandered?
That's bad.
I'm just saying, if you allocate it by district, then right. So could be an issue.
Could be. Well, absolutely, it could be an issue. And also, the campaigning would be even narrower. Yeah. It turns out, well, because of gerrymandering, right?
Right.
So right now, 94% of campaigning happens in 6-7 states, not even in the entire states, in towns and counties. So that would actually get exasperated by a district-wide allocation of electoral votes.
Although this year, the Delaware River would get a lot of attention because there's 4 swing districts on either side of the Delaware River. Right. So like from here to like High Point, which is a place in New Jersey. Yeah. From here to High Point on both sides, there's like 4 districts, and Harris and Trump would be just like boating up and down the Delaware. So
Right. Yeah.
They wouldn't come to Princeton, though.
They would not come to, or Massachusetts, anywhere in Massachusetts. Yeah.
I don't always understand the gerrymandering procedure, but I think mathematically, can you unpackage whether it's inefficient or efficient?
Efficient in what sense? Does it produce the outcomes that the gerrymander hopes to?
It must produce the outcome, but is that democratic?
Is your question how is an advantage gained by that procedure? Is that your question?
That's a better frame of it, my question. Yeah, I'm trying to understand in terms of the math, how does it work? And it's the democratic aspect of it. Is it a mathematical choice?
Yeah. So the basic idea is you want to decide district lines in a certain way so that you are guaranteed a win, that your candidate will get a win or win in as many districts as possible. Now that seems counterintuitive. You're like, okay, I have so many voters who are Democrats, so many who are Republicans in this state. What's it matter how I divide, how the borders of the district work out? But it turns out that makes a huge difference. So one of the tricks, sort of the bread and butter trick of gerrymandering, is so-called packing and cracking. So you can, like stuff a lot of voters of one party into some districts that are throwaway districts. You're going to lose those, and then crack the rest of the voters into the other districts in numbers that they can't win in any of those districts. So when you lose big, and that's okay. But you've done away with a lot of the voters of the opposing side like that, and you're winning in a lot of remaining districts because the remaining opposing voters, there aren't that many in them. So if you do this very carefully, and these days it's really easy to do it. There are computational tools that any of us can get online and start districting.
A high school student could log on to a free online app and draw a bang-up gerrymander by going to davesredistricting.org and they could take,
That's right. Or district
build a
terror.
few 80% districts for one side and stuff all their enemies into a few districts,
Right.
and then take their own guys and make like little 55, 45 districts. So imagine if all of New Jersey were divided into Princetons, which are 80-20 districts for Democrats, and then, maybe, I don't know, Hamilton or Flemington or Ringo's or whatever, and you build these districts that are, say, 55-45 for Republicans. You could conceivably build a secure majority for Republicans in New Jersey, which is a heavily Democratic state. You could still build a strongly Republican legislature by building a lot of, Princetons.
Right. So, there's a deceit to it. Well,
it would be
often
the pit- it
legally,
would be
it's
the
not.
pits.
Yeah.
It would be bad. It's bad to take the minority, and it would be bad to force one party to always be the minority, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. It's bad.
The courts would not necessarily agree with you. This is one of the problems. They would say it's just politics, and we're leaving it to the states. In fact, one of the big rulings a few years ago was that, like, federal courts are not going to get into this business of deciding what's gerrymandering or what's not gerrymandering unless, like the Civil Rights, Voting Rights Act has been violated or something like that. But showing that this is the case, showing that partisan gerrymandering has crossed into racial gerrymandering is actually really difficult. That's where the judiciary is not clear on.
It would have been helpful to have a national federal standard for this, but right now the way that this particular issue is being addressed, actually in some cases successfully, is state by state. This fall, Wisconsin has a majoritarian election for the first time in 15 years because a court there forced the redrawing of the state legislative map. So Wisconsinites get majority rule in their state legislature for the first time, like since since the Clinton administration, I think. I have to think, or no, since the George W. Bush administration. Right. So it's such change is possible.
Right.
That's why I mentioned Ohio. Ohio gets to vote on whether they get such a change, but it has to be done at a state level. And this gets into, there's a meme of whether you'd rather fight, one horse-sized duck or 50 duck-sized horses.
Right,
and anti-gerrymandering has turned into 50 duck-sized horses.
And in most democracies that use anything that's similar to our districting method, this is really just a boring, mundane activity. Nobody even knows that some districting is happening because independent, people who are doing this are apolitical. They just do it in a.
Yeah, we didn't do that.
No.
Sad.
And both parties do this. I mean, just to be perfectly clear. Now, the Republicans are better at it because they actually had a plan starting in 20 years ago.
Right. In your book, you write about this plan.
And I write about it. So it's really it's like this thriller, right? I mean, a movie should be made out of this Republican effort to gain flip as many districts, state and federal, over the course of like 10 years, and it worked beautifully.
In that respect, it was clever to have people who are technically able among Republican strategists to come up with this plan at a national level. Right. It was a clever use of rules.
Yeah.
It was bad, but it was clever.
Yes. No. Hats off, definitely. Yeah.
So I'm a math major from Smith, by the way, and I just wanted to ask you two questions. The first is Monte Carlo simulations for gerrymandering in the judiciary. I thought that there had been some success on that, and that we had been able to get some mathematical techniques used to get rid of poor gerrymandering cases. And the second question is, so if you have a better representation, there's even more representation in Congress, would it be harder or easier to actually pass good legislation because you have more people?
Those are good questions. First of all, I can't talk to you because you're Smith and I'm Wellesley. So there's a problem. There's a problem right there. Right? There's an excellent question. The first, so gerrymandering is like this frontier of applied mathematics right now. There's really some cool math being brought to bear in detecting gerrymandering, right? And there have been a lot of mathematical attempts to sort of quantify when something's gerrymandered and when it's not, but none of them are sufficient because they're trying to be too simple. They're trying to cater to, like the judiciary, the justices, who can just like zoom in on this one number and that would tell them something's gerrymandered or not. Gerrymandering is too big of a problem to be reducible to a single number. But these Monte Carlo methods, these probabilistic methods, have really shown to be extremely fruitful. So the idea is you generate lots and lots of random, not really random, but maths that kind of could have been, like millions, billions of maps, and then you test something. You see who would win in each district, under these millions of math, or you see what, the efficiency gap or something. You apply some measure to all the possible hypothetical maps that could have been drawn, right? And then you usually get a distribution of how things would have turned out. Like this outcome is the most likely because that's the peak of the distribution. These are less likely. Typically, if a map is gerrymandered carefully, that map is over here, all right? and everything else that's likely is here. So that's pointing to, it's not a definitive judgment on whether something was gerrymandered or not, but it just says, this is what I like about it. It's not like a normative thing. It doesn't say, oh, we've crossed some threshold or some number, we're past some number and therefore we're gerrymandered. No, it just says this is extremely unlikely to have happened if it wasn't done with great sort of intent and care, right? And that's all.
And practically there have been successes in courts.
Yes, right.
Mostly in state courts specifically doing this, but of course it requires a state court to be willing to consider such evidence. And it's certainly possible. And also it's sometimes used by commissions. So a commission will sometimes adopt such computational methods to say, okay, is this map very extreme? And that happens as well.
It's a little bit hard to bring in all the myriad, restrictions that one has on, just for example, the Voting Rights Act or geography, et cetera. Yeah. So you have to build those things into the model. And I think people are becoming more and more successful at doing that.
And this is all in Chapter 12 of Ismar's book.
It's all Chapter 12.
Chapter 12.
There's the bar graph.
Yeah.
But the second question is also interesting. If I'm not mistaken, the question is, if the legislature was larger, would it be easier? So it depends on how large it is. So again, U.S. House of Representatives has been stuck at 435 for 100 years for absolutely no good reason. It just, in 1920s, there was bickering, and, the number was frozen at 435 because of the anti-immigrant sentiment of the 20s. And it is a relic of that time, right? Most legislatures around the world grow with population. Ours has not in 100 years. So this is one of those, mathematical atrocities in our democracy. So it should be bigger, more than 435. But what's the right number? And that's an interesting question. That's a mathematical question. And I think if it was past a certain point, it would be much harder to arrive at consensus, to reach across the aisle, to form coalitions. But if it's up, I'd say 700.
Yeah. Okay. Although directly to the gerrymandering question, so you have a whole chapter of your book also about the proper size for the legislature, and so that's another good chapter. But directly to the question, Wisconsin has about 12 times as many legislative districts as congressional districts, and it was still very gerrymandered. And so apparently 12 times as many was not enough.
Enough, right?
So,
oh yeah, you still would have
Yeah.
Right.
So I think honestly, math can play a critical role in identifying and offenses and devising strategies. I mean, my own view of this, working in this area, is that there's a process question, and one needs to have the math as a tool. And then one has to set up processes that use the tools. And the difficulty in achieving reform is finding ways to use these things together in a wise way.
Exactly right. And optimize them against all these other constraints, right? Yeah. So the sizes of houses, chambers, is a really deep and difficult mathematical question.
So we are right at the hour. I don't want to prevail upon our guests any longer than they're willing to let us. Do we have time for one or two more questions?
Maybe one more, and then we can, if people are a little worn out, we can have a smaller conversation. Is that okay?
Yeah,
You mentioned the Electoral College workaround. What about the National Popular Vote Coalition, if I have that right? What do you think about that?
The compact.
What we were referring to, that's the.
But the compact with California and Texas would be
Oh, that was
on
just
a
a
broader
particular example. That was just,
Right.
it was, yeah, so,
So the compact is at around 218 now or something. I forget how many states have signed on to it, but these states are saying if enough states agree and we hit 270 with the number of electoral votes that these states represent, we all pledge to allocate our electoral votes according to the results of the national popular vote.
Right.
So that guarantees a win for the national popular vote winner. So that's the workaround around the Electoral College and around the Constitution. But yeah, it would require a few red states to sign on at this point, and it's small states, and they like the attention they get from at least 3 electoral votes. So it's probably not going to happen, and it's not even clear it would stand, if it happened, it would stand up to like the judicial scrutiny. I mean, all the hell would break loose, you know.
the U.S. Constitution stipulates that interstate compacts must be approved by Congress.
Right. But it was the backstory is really interesting. Again, as I was researching stuff for this book, so the person who came up with this is the guy who invented scratch-off tickets.
John Koza.
John Koza. And
He's a computer scientist.
Yeah, he's a computer scientist. Actually, yeah, he's a neuroscientist, right?
No.
Originally, no, he was not. No.
He invented scratch-offs, though. He did invent scratch-offs. That he did.
But you know, states started entering these compacts to maximize, you know, the return on the lottery, and that's how he came up. Apparently, that's the story. How he came up with the idea of this electoral college
it is
compact.
a tough lift because of purple states and red states. Somebody has to be willing to give up their role, and that is a tough lift. It was a clever idea, and you know, could work at some point when things are not so fraught. I just brought up California, Texas as kind of this impressionistic. You know, Picasso could draw a face with just like one stroke, and so the stripped down version of the National Popular Vote Compact that would work would be just the California Texas Compact would be enough to actually work. I mean, it's a silly idea, but it's a difficult time for doing that. I think.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that was the last question. So let's thank our guests one more time.
Great.
Pleasure.
It was fun.
That was great.